Hello and welcome to another article by the AHF. In this particular one, we're going to be looking at, is there actually a correct way to use a sword? And this comes up quite often on videos where you'll get comments, particularly where there are mixed styles, whether they're mixed European or European and Middle Eastern and Eastern styles, things like that being thrown together, or against one another. You'll get these comments of, somebody's using the sword wrong, or using the weapon wrong, or using the wrong style. So we're going to look actually at the subject overall, what we think of it, and sort of how it really relates to everything that we do. Now, first of all, what do people mean by using a sword wrong, or wrongly, actually? Well, it usually comes up in relation to the katana. And that's because people have got, or a lot of people have now got this idea that the katana was used in a very, very specific manner. And it's usually because they've seen an awful lot of kendo. And of course, kendo is a sport form, just like sport fencing is to historical fencing, and it has become quite derivative. So that's the first thing to consider is, don't base everything you know of the katana on kendo, just as you shouldn't base everything you know of saber, like a military saber like this, based on Olympic saber, which doesn't have much in common anymore. So that's the first thing to consider. Is there are kind of historically so many variations. We know, for example, in Japan, there were hundreds of schools of swordsmanship teaching different methods, and it is quite well documented that there were an awful lot of different styles and methods taught. So you can't just look at one particular style and say, that's not how you use a katana. A prime example would be, you see one of our European fencers using a katana, and they're using the guard of tag or vamtag, which is high up on the shoulder here, and people think that's not how you should use a katana. But go back and look at some Kenjutsu stuff and you'll find that exact guard. In fact, if you look through some more historical sort of martial-based sword systems for the Japanese katana, you will actually find almost every version of the guards in German longsword, and with only small differences here and there, you will essentially find all the guards carry over from one to the other system. So that's the first thought. The second one is, what do people actually mean by, are you using the sword right or wrongly? A lot of swords were used across multiple different cultures, and we know, for example, that the katana was exported in large numbers throughout the European Renaissance to different nations. So it was used outside of Japan. It was, of course, used on ships and captured by different people as well. So it could be used in a range of different manners according to a range of different schools, and it could be used by people who aren't at all trained in anything related to a Japanese martial art. And that takes us back to the Europeans. Look to the rapier, for example, is that people might look at the rapier and say, why aren't you circling, for example? Well, that's because if you want to circle, you're looking at something like the Spanish destreza stuff, which is circular motion, quite upright, stepping off either foot, usual constant motion, that kind of thing. And it's really nothing like the sort of Italian rapier that I teach, and is very common in the Italian system, of something like Capoferro, which is linear with lots of lunge work and not any sort of unnecessary movement. So you've got the same weapon there. The Italian and the Spanish rapiers of the early 17th century were essentially the same. Before the cup hilt got developed, they were exactly the same. So you've got exactly the same weapon used in completely different ways. And there are different systems as well on rapier. If you look at some of the German stuff, you look at some of the English stuff that's documented, and you've got different systems again. You look to Swetnam, and his approach is quite different still. So what is the correct way to use the sword? Well, arguably the correct way to use the sword is the way that wins. That's one argument that you could make, and it's a reasonable argument to make. You go into a fight, you win with that sword. That could be considered the correct way. Of course, if you are in full safety gear and it's kind of a sportive approach, winning might be quite different to how it would actually be if the swords were sharp and you weren't wearing that protective gear. Winning might be a little bit different. It could be scored differently, the result could be quite different. So you've got to consider that as well. Is, what are you trying to achieve? Are you trying to win with a sword? Are you trying to represent a historical system? Are you trying to learn from that historical system in order to be able to win a fight? Or are you trying to replicate what you see in the manual and try and reproduce it so that at every moment in your fight you look like the plates in the book? And all of those points are valid. Not everybody will agree with them all, but they're all potential arguments that you could make. So what is the correct way to use a sword? It is really down to what you want to achieve with it. Certainly throughout much of the Renaissance and onwards, and even before then, swords were being exported all over the world from different nations and used by different fighters with different skills and sometimes no skills at all. So you're going to see a massive spectrum both historically and today. So what is the correct method? Well, if you look at our fights with the katana, we're quite open and we say this is a European longswordsman, trained longswordsman using a katana. There you go. It's not a wrong method, it's just a different method. And if you look, say, to sabres, for example, the sabre is probably the most widespread and widely used sword in history because it's spread to most corners of the earth and over hundreds of years was used by most nations. And if you look, for example, here, we've got an Indian talwar or talwar, and it's of the same era of this is a rifle officer's sword, a classic British infantry sword of the 19th century. And this is an Indian sword of roughly the same era. And how different are they? Well, in this particular case, this one's more curved than this sword. This one doesn't have a knuckle bow, so there's a few differences here and there. However, you can find plenty of talwars with knuckle bows, and you can find them with less curvature. So, and of course with British sabres, you can find British sabres with a lot more curvature than this. If you go back to Napoleonic, which is only a little bit earlier than this, you'll find extremely curved blades, far more so than even most talwars. So, how does something like the Indian sabre, which is talwar, compared to British sabre? Well, it's just, you're going to have to compare like for like examples because you will find plenty that have so much in common, it's unbelievable. And the Indians often bought in British blades to mount onto their hilts, and often you'd find the British swords being mounted with foreign blades. For example, in the Napoleonics, it was popular to fit sort of Shamshir, Persian Shamshir blades on their swords, or at least Shamshir inspired sometimes. And then, once you've got a sword that is essentially the same from two different cultures, even though you're talking about the UK to India, how different is it then? Well, it comes down to the style. I've seen some interesting fighting styles with the talwar type weapons, like Gatka, for example. You can look at some of the stuff they do in that, which is often representing this kind of sword. And yeah, the style is quite different to what we do in British sabre, as is if you go and look at, for example, the interpretations of Polish sabre, that's quite different to British sabre. And yet, Polish sabres are in essence identical to Napoleonic British sabres. And that's because of the influence from Hungary at the time. And then you've got to ask yourself, which person is doing it right? The British sabre practitioner, the Polish sabre practitioner, the Indian, and they all have very different methods, because if you look at the styles of those three, they are very different, and yet between them, a lot of the swords they're using are near enough identical. So who's doing it right? Well, you have to ask yourself, what actually do you want out of that fight? Do you want to represent something historical? Do you want to just win? Do you want a combination of the two? There's no simple answer to it. There really isn't. What I would say, because obviously what we do with historical fencing, we do study historical styles. And where possible, we always use documented material to actually learn from. So even though we're going to throw in something in our sparring videos that we don't normally use, like a katana or some Viking shields or something like that, we're using them according to knowledge that we've got from documented source material. We're not just making shit up. So that's the sort of overall topic, is what is the right or wrong way to use a sword? There isn't a right or wrong way to use a sword, other than don't actually stab yourself. As long as you're not actually hurting yourself and you are able to beat an opponent, that is technically the right way to use a sword. But yeah, we would encourage people to actually use them in some kind of historically documented way, even if it's not related to the weapon itself, because again, there's so many users of different swords that are from outside their culture that really isn't an issue. And how different is a different sword from a different culture? Well, sabres, you'll find plenty of comparison from one to another. And if you want to start comparing the katana to European longsword, as much as people might say it, they aren't that different when you actually put them into practice. It all comes down to how large is the individual example you're looking at. Of course, the katana is typically a bit smaller, a good bit smaller. than the European longsword. There are plenty of curved European longswords that's a little bit closer again to the katana, and there are larger Japanese swords which are, in comparison to sort of size and weight, proportionally to a lot of European swords. And I would expect somebody trained in a katana to be able to use a longsword almost as successfully with half an hour's practice, because it transitions that quickly. And in terms of a saber, well, I would expect somebody trained with a saber to be able to pick up any other saber in the world and be able to use it immediately. And the only real consideration would be how much protection do you have, and that might just affect how far you have your hand forward in certain techniques and how much you depend upon it in some parries. Saying that, you shouldn't parry with the basket hilt or the dish hilt anyway. So there you go. Is there a right or wrong way to use a sword? Well, kind of, but it's really not as simple as you see this sword, you think of this style, that's the only way a sword can be used. So I hope you enjoyed the video. Thanks for watching.